Hi everybody, it's great to be back, and this is the final lecture, lecture 9. This time it's on the Passion narrative and the resurrection. The Passion narrative, of course, is about the death of the Lord. And the book that I'm using mainly is this wonderful book. It's a huge book. It's by Raymond Brown, and it's called The Death of the Messiah, 2 volumes, and it came out in 1994. So, on the blurb of that book, it says this: the supreme achievement of a deeply pastoral scholar. Sander Schneider says that. Breathtaking, said Burton Vitosky of the Jewish Theological Seminary of the States. And he continued, no one concerned with Jewish-Christian relationships should fail to study his deliberate, sensitive and nuanced treatment of the trial of Jesus. Brown has once again demonstrated his position as Father, Rabbi and Teacher of us all. Isn't that beautiful? The Passion narrative, of course, from Gethsemane to the grave, is the longest action section of all the Gospels. Aesthetically, says Raymond Brown, it's captured the attention of dramatists and musicians and artists. Literally, Passion vignettes have left their mark on our language. Think of the Judas kiss, or 30 pieces of silver, or washing one's hands of something. Historically, Jesus' life crosses the path of such significant historical figures as Pontius Pilate, Roman governor, high priests Annas and Caiaphas. Theologically, Christians interpreted the Passion narrative of Jesus as being part of the plan of God. And spiritually, it's used constantly for meditation, for the way of the cross. And pastorally, of course, it's the centre of Holy Week. In sum, writes Raymond Brown, from every point of view, the Passion is the central narrative in the Christian story. Well, of course, this is so because, for many reasons, the early Christians kept vivid the memory of what had happened to Jesus, as all of us remember the last days and the last hours of people we love who die. And they searched the scriptures to try to come to some grips of understanding of this enormous catastrophe that had happened to Jesus. Matthew follows St. Mark, and they present us a Jesus who is abandoned by all his followers. He falls into the abyss. And he endures the crucifixion alone and in the most agonizing fashion. The Jewish trial centers on the accusation that he wanted to destroy the sanctuary or the temple. And Jesus is acknowledged as Messiah at that Jewish trial. He's accused of blasphemy there. The Roman trial, however, centers on Jesus as being King of the Jews. And Matthew and Mark frame this whole Passion narrative, with 2 prayers of Jesus. Let this cup pass from me in the Garden of Gethsemane, and my God, why have you abandoned me? As he dies on the cross. And Matthew's theological position is a bit different from Mark. Matthew follows Mark in every episode pretty well, but adds a little bit more especially about Judas, because his concern is who's really guilty for this man's death. Okay, the next thing I'd like to do is to talk about how Jesus his words over the bread and the cup are interpreted in St. Matthew's Gospel. So this is just before the Passion narrative commences. Some people have it as part of the narrative. Well, our synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, present the Last Supper as the Passover meal. And because they do that, they know very well that it's a special ritual meal. And there's a blessing over the bread at the beginning of the meal. Then the meal goes on and the Paschal lamb is eaten and so on. And at the end of the meal, there is a blessing over the fourth cup of wine. And everybody shares that. The liturgical prayer of that long prayer over the fourth cup of wine is called a thanksgiving prayer. And it has three dimensions. There's thanksgiving, there's remembrance, we remember what's the feast day we're gathered for, and we intercede for the peace of Jerusalem. In the New Testament, there are three different traditions of what happened at the Last Supper when Jesus instituted the Eucharist, as we say. So, they are 1 Corinthians from St. Paul, St. Luke, and then Matthew and Mark. Matthew writes like this: while they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "Take it and eat, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink all of you, for this is my blood, the blood of the covenant, which is to be poured out for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I won't drink of the vine until the day I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom." Just a couple of thoughts. He blesses the bread, and that's true, it's a blessing. And the word for that is oilego, eulogy, bless. We bless God in prayer. But over the cup, the longer prayer is he gives thanks. Oikaristeo, Eucharist. And nowadays we just have one big prayer, a Eucharist prayer, over the blessing of the bread and the wine. So the blessing prayer over the bread is being incorporated into the great Thanksgiving prayer. And it's got threefold structure, the Eucharistic prayer, of thanksgiving to God, remembering why we've gathered, the death and resurrection of Jesus, and we intercede for the living and the dead. Now, of course, the early Christians understood Jesus' shedding of blood, the blood of the covenant, as a sign of a new covenant. The new covenant with God commences and is renewed with the Eucharist. The suffering servant of Isaiah 53 bears the sins of many, and Jesus fulfills this because his death, his shedding of blood, is for the forgiveness of sins. So when Jesus was there, and as we are too, every time we gather for Eucharist, we look backwards to the original covenant on Mount Sinai, to the blood on the doorposts in Egypt, to manna in the desert, and to those lovely meals Jesus had with his disciples and with everybody who wasn't worthy of being a full member of the Jewish family. And so we remember all that. And then Jesus transforms it all, what they're doing at this Passover meal, by relating it to his own passion the following day. And that's what we remember always, his death and resurrection. And of course he anticipates the heavenly banquet. So there's a little bit about Matthew's understanding of the Last Supper. Now the next big scene is Gethsemane. And what do we really understand about Jesus from this scene? Well, for a moment, an extraordinary thing happens. We enter Jesus' soul and we hear him pray. When people pray, it's their inmost feelings and thoughts. And we see him struggle as he tries to understand how on earth his forthcoming death would fit into the coming of the kingdom, and how on earth he could face it as a human being. This beautiful Jesus is one with us in his agony, in his facing in fear of death. And after his struggle, he comes to the point where he can say, "Not my will, but thine be done." And didn't he teach us to pray, "Thy will be done"? And so he practices what he preaches in a most beautiful and extraordinary way. And so we can, because he's given us the example, take up our cross in our day. Just a lovely little thing I found. There's an allusion to Genesis chapter 22. And that is that beautiful story of Abraham taking his most beloved son with him up the mountain, because he's heard God say, "You've got to sacrifice your only son," which of course is such a poignant sort of a moment in Scripture, the way it's beautifully written for us. And in it he says, "Sit here, Isaac, while I go over there and pray and worship." It's exactly, and a most unusual word, here, sit here, an unusual word. It's the same word that's in Matthew and in the book of Genesis. So we're in that extraordinary scene for a moment. But the other thing is too, just to say, is that we have an independent witness to Gethsemane, and that is the letter to the Hebrews. And can I just read you a little bit of that now? And it's this. "For it isn't as though we have a high priest who is incapable of feeling our weaknesses. We have one who has been tempted in every way that we are. Let us then be confident in approaching the throne of grace." That's from Hebrews chapter 4. And in chapter 5, "During his life on earth, he offered up prayer and entreaty, aloud and in silent tears, to the one who had the power to save him from death. And he submitted so humbly that his prayer was heard." We learn a lot from that experience of Gethsemane, and from the synoptics of Gethsemane, and from Hebrews. Now I come to another very big matter, and that is, what is central to the Jewish authorities' condemnation of Jesus? And then I'll add a little bit to the Roman condemnation of Jesus. Firstly, it looks as though it's a big Sanhedrin trial when Jesus is brought first to the high priest's home. Well, no, that wouldn't be so. It's really a little bit of an interrogation, perhaps with the high priest only and some of his attendants, perhaps a few others are there. Now the high priest we know is Caiaphas, who ruled from 18 to 37, a long time, 19 years. But there's a power behind the throne, Annas, because his children, 5 of his kids, one a son-in-law and a grandson, have all been high priests as well. So there's an extraordinary sense of Caiaphas and Annas here. Now, all four Gospels have a Sanhedrin scene with the charge of causing destruction of the sanctuary or temple as the prominent charge. And they all have Jesus then being questioned about being a Messiah, the Son of God. And then they charge him with a secondary charge of blasphemy, which we know is the more important. What did happen? Well, we believe that Raymond Brown would say this, that Jesus had a fairly long ministry in Galilee, but also a long ministry in Jerusalem. And he was often preaching in the temple. And his actions there, we remember when he overturned the money changers and so on, were a prophetic action. He's speaking out about its destruction. All that would have focused hostility towards him. So there was a Sanhedrin meeting to deal with Jesus, probably in the weeks before the Passover. And at that, there were some witnesses who came forward who spoke about the destruction of the temple. And there's no evidence that at that Sanhedrin meeting the charge of Messiah or Son of God or blasphemy was raised. But after he was arrested, there comes a second sort of time with the Sanhedrin, or rather, this time it's just the high priest. Although we really don't know what the subject of that interrogation was. But in the mind of the evangelists, they have the problem here is Messiah, Son of God, and blasphemy. That seems to be the substance. And in fact, as Matthew puts it, it goes like this: I put you on oath, says the high priest, by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of God. Now, our biggest problems are, would they have used those words, Messiah, Christ, the Son of God? Would they have used those words? It would seem that they probably were not used of Jesus until after his death. And if I could just say this very, very quickly, Jesus may have been called occasionally from his opponents and even from one or two of his disciples Messiah, but Jesus never accepted it. Really, he was ambiguous because it meant so many different things. So it didn't really define who he was. But after he died, the word became so common in Christian circles, very quickly it became almost like a surname. Jesus the Messiah, Jesus Christ. We almost think of it as a surname. So after he died, it became very clear that he really was the Messiah. But the high priest may not have been used. More than likely it wasn't used at the high priest's interrogation, nor was Son of God. But very quickly it became used by the early Christians after his death and resurrection. So Brown would make this comment: if Jesus was charged with blasphemy, it's unlikely that the main cause was the Messiah or Son of God appellation. What about Son of Man? Well, yes, it would seem Jesus did use that title. And connected with his use of that title was that in some way judgment was coming, and in some way he'd be part of that judgment. So, but Brown says this, can I just read you this again? While it's possible Jesus' use of the Son of Man could have been considered blasphemous, it's imprudent to base the historicity of the blasphemy charge against Jesus on his use of that title. So if they did charge him with blasphemy, it's probably for a more subtle and a wider source of realities, such as the fact that he taught with authority. Where does that come from? He forgave sins. Can only God do that? He interpreted the Torah, reinterpreted it in a most extraordinary way. He prayed to God as Abba, Father. He proclaimed judgment was coming and so on. If you don't follow the gospel, you're out. If you don't follow the kingdom, rather, you're out. So from all of those, there probably came the sense that this man is putting himself up, in sense, with divine prerogatives and needs to be done away with. So that's as much as we can go really on the Jewish authorities and their part in Jesus' crucifixion. What about the Romans? Well, a little word here. Jesus was handed over to the Roman prefect by the Jewish authorities. The charge on which he was condemned was to be King of the Jews, a title which was used in the 2nd and 1st century before our Lord by people that were King of the Jews. And Herod the Great was the last person with that title in Jesus' lifetime. After that, there was a Roman procurator. There was another king, just after Herod, who lasted a little while as King of the Jews. There was a Roman procurator. Here's another, perhaps, King of the Jews. But of course, this is said with great irony by the Romans. The prefect, the procurator, recognized there was antagonism to Jesus, but under orchestrated pressure, he gave in, while realizing the charge against Jesus was a sham. And it's probable there was some connection with a certain Barabbas. Okay. The next thing I'd like to look at, if you haven't fallen asleep, is who was ultimately responsible for Jesus' death? Ultimately responsible. And I'm just going to look at it from Matthew's point of view. Because if you look at it totally, you can sort of see Judas has a part, the Jewish authorities have a part, the crowd has a part, but so do the Roman authorities have a part. But from Matthew's point of view, we'll see where he places the blame. Judas betrays him, that's clear. Yet Judas becomes guilt-ridden. I have betrayed innocent blood. And he hangs himself. Now there's a little bit of folklore in this particular portrait of what happens to Judas. Because if you remember in the Old Testament, Joseph, the wonderful Joseph, who was sold as a slave, was sold as a slave for 30 pieces of silver by his brothers. King David, the wonderful King David, was betrayed by Ahithophel. What does Ahithophel do? He goes out and hangs himself. So, those allusions to the Old Testament make us think that that's influenced very much Matthew's portrayal of what happens to Judas. Now, Pilate realizes that the Jewish people really are not behaving well when they hand that Jesus up. So, in the end he says, I'm innocent of this man's blood. That's what Matthew has Pilate doing and washing his hands and hearing what his wife says and all of that. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin, Matthew uses those words, and the elders, the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin. Now they turn out to be, in Matthew's eyes, pretty nasty people, because they, before the interrogation at Caiaphas' house, they were looking for evidence, however false, on which they might pronounce the death sentence. They wanted to get rid of him. Then they had persuaded the crowd to release Barabbas and execute Jesus. That's what they were trying to do. And a third point, weren't they so callous to poor Judas when he came back begging to take the money back and let him go? What's that to us? What do we care? So they don't turn out to be very good in Matthew's eyes. And of course the people, well, this is those extraordinary words. His blood be upon us and upon our children. Now, what Matthew's probably saying is that the reason that the temple, which was destroyed in 70 AD, 40 years after Jesus, the reason why that was destroyed because the Jewish people failed to recognize Jesus as the true Messiah. And God punished the Jewish people for that. Now that sort of idea is pretty Jewish as well, because the great Josephus, who was writing at the time of Matthew, who was a Jewish leader, says that the destruction of the temple was because the Jewish people had sinned in some way. So there's a punishment idea common to Christians and common to Jewish people. But of course, as people read that in history, and as our medieval brothers and sisters read it, his blood be upon us and upon our children, they said the Jewish people killed the Son of God. They're responsible forever. And that's part of the history of anti-Semitism. And Matthew has that, if it's taken out of context. We've got to remember, don't we, when we read Matthew, that he's writing at the time when he's saying, we, followers of Jesus, have the correct interpretation of the Torah, and the Pharisees don't. So his struggle is a real struggle between synagogue and church. But in the medieval period, of course, it became very much a matter of saying that Jewish people are bad and they were suffering terribly at the hands of Christians. That's Matthew's view of who's responsible for the death of Jesus, and we can see it's got anti-Semitic tones. What about Judas's betrayal and Peter's denials? Is there any connection? How do they fit in? Well, the earliest form of the Passion narrative, of course, had Judas betraying Jesus, and the failure of all the disciples, including Peter, when he was challenged by a female servant at the high priest's hall. Now, the formation as a separate narrative of Peter's threefold denial and the cockcrow came a bit later. Probably as Peter emerged as more and more visible in the church, so the story got a little bit embellished. But there is a little connection in Matthew that's pretty significant. It's how we deal with when we've failed. Matthew says, having gone out, he wept bitterly. And then of Judas, it says, having gone out, he hanged himself. We're meant to see a little bit of a parallel there in the ways we deal with our betrayals and our sins. And just finally a word about Barabbas, if I may. There's no evidence whatsoever of a Passover pardon. You know, the custom at Passover for the governor, no evidence of that. He may have been pardoned, though, of his crimes around the time of Jesus' execution, and he was brought into the story because of the irony of his name. His full name is Jesus, Son of the Abba, the Father. And if he who is guilty is let free, and the real Jesus, Son of the Father, is executed, there's a supreme irony in that. He who is the innocent one. Now, I'd like to spend, the next thing is the three mocking scenes when Jesus is mocked. It's pretty important to say that there's very little weight or embellishment on the flogging scene or the crucifixion scene. What we're focusing on in the whole of the Passion narrative is not the flogging or the actual execution, but the way Jesus was mocked. That's where a lot of detail comes in all the Gospels, but Matthew included. And there are three mocking scenes. The first is after the high priest's condemnation. Historically, it is possible that he might have been slapped or roughed up a bit by one of the attendants or two of the attendants. But we really don't think that, as it says, they spat on his face and hit him with their fists. And others said, as they struck him, "Play the prophet, Christ, Messiah. Who hit you?" It's placed in there because of Matthew uses mockery to show us that really these human beings are saying things which they don't realise are supremely true. They're pretending he's a false prophet, the Messiah, all of that. But isn't that who he is? The prophet, the Messiah, the Christ. Okay, the next mocking scene is after the Roman trial. I should just say this little bit too. At the Roman trial, there's just a single sentence in all the Gospels about Jesus being flogged. That's all. Here in Matthew it goes like this. Having had Jesus flogged, he gave him over in order that he be crucified. So what the Stations of the Cross have done, of course, is focus on that, as is Mel Gibson's Passion, the Passion. But really, in the Gospels, there's not a focus on that. There's a focus on who is this person that's being executed. Anyway, after the flogging, and flogging, by the way, it seems was always part of the execution process. So it's not an extra thing. In St. John's Gospel, it has, we'll have him flogged and then see if they'll release him. They might have a bit of tenderness towards him. Now, how it happened is more than likely he was flogged after he was condemned to death. And then it says this, then the soldiers of the governor, taking Jesus into the praetorium, gathered together the whole cohort against him. Gathered together, the word is synagogue, which means, of course, gather together, but also we think a little bit of the Jewish gathering. They placed on him a scarlet cloak, and his head a crown of thorns. They placed a reed for a scepter in his hands. Then they knelt before him, and they acclaimed him as king. And then they abused him. They spat, and they beat his head. But the mockery, of course, is the key thing. And they're mocking him as a king. But you and I know he really is their king. And his kingdom will last forever. Interestingly, just a small point, but both the Jewish authorities and the Gentile authorities, mock Jesus in Matthew's Gospel, so they equally share in guilt, if you like, but just in being part of the death process. But then there's the final mocking. That's when he's on the cross. The passers-by, the chief priests and the elders, etc., and even the robbers mock him. And in each of these mockeries, titles are imposed on Jesus, which of course are profoundly true. He destroyed this temple. If he is the Son of God, wouldn't he come down from the cross? He saved others. He's a saviour. Couldn't he save himself? If he's the King of Israel, the Son of God, and so on. Little do they know that the words they say are true in a deeper way than they believed. How did Jesus die? This is the second last thing you'll be delighted to know. Jesus was led out of the city, it says, to the place of execution. Normally, There was a vertical cross at the place of execution, and the person who was to be executed carried behind the nape of his neck the crossbeam itself. They got a passerby, Simon of Cyrene. Well, there was a whole Jewish colony in Cyrenaica, the capital of Cyrene, and they had a synagogue themselves in Jerusalem. So it's quite possible that Simon of Cyrene helped Jesus carry that cross. And his two children are mentioned in one of the Gospels, Rufus and Alexander. We wonder why this is all remembered. It's possible that they became Christians, and that's why they're there. The crucifixion was a public event, so there of course would have been the soldiers, there would have been passers-by, there would have been onlookers. Although the way they're painted in the Gospel has a little bit to do with the way onlookers are painted in the Old Testament as they look at the suffering servant. We're a bit unsure though whether the family and friends were there, because in some crucifixion events around this time, no member of the family is allowed anywhere near the place. What are his last words? You might remember that that's a beautiful part of the musical tradition, the 7 last words of Jesus. Well, what did he say? Well, if you add up all the different Gospels, there are 7 different things. But what really happened? Well, in the way that Matthew and Mark portray it is Jesus says one thing. Now it may have been he said nothing, like the suffering servant. It may have been. It may have been he just gave a loud cry without any word being formulated, just a loud cry. Or it may have been he yelled out, Eli, Ata, a Hebrew phrase meaning, you are my God, which in Aramaic, the local language, is very close to the word Elijah. That may have been there. Or he may have called out what is said in Matthew and Mark, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you abandoned me? A phrase from the Psalms. Jesus dies in utter desolation. The cause of death, shock. Not asphyxiation, shock because of immense dehydration and loss of blood. Okay, just the last thing I'd like to say a little bit about is the resurrection. How does Matthew speak of the resurrection? Well, as in the infancy narratives, there are 5 scenes you'll be delighted to know. The 5 scenes are: Jesus is buried by a disciple, Joseph. Then the baddies come on the scene, the chief priests and the Pharisees. And they place a guard at the tomb because they don't want him to get out of it. And then a lovely scene, the resurrection itself. The women arrive, angels frighten the guards, and they tell the women that Jesus is risen, and then Jesus appears to them. The resurrection scene. And then the baddies again, the guards are bribed by the Sanhedrin to lie about the body because it's disappeared. So we'll give you some money to tell them that his disciples came. And that's of course the story that the Jewish people still say. They're the baddies again. But finally, the extraordinary scene of Jesus on the mountain and commissioning the disciples to become apostles and go out to the whole Gentile world and make disciples and baptize them and teach them all that we've done. So can I just say a little brief word about the resurrection, the middle one, and about the last one, the commissioning on the mountain. Now, in Matthew's Gospel, the earth quakes at the resurrection, as it does at the death of Jesus. So something of cosmic proportions is happening. The angel came from heaven, and the angel rolls back the stone. And his face is like lightning, which is a bit apocalyptic. This face is like lightning. Then the angel, like when all angels appear in the infancy narratives, instructs the women what to do and interprets for them the empty tomb. The empty tomb is because he's risen. And now this is what we want you to do. Go and tell the disciples. So there are parallels with the Annunciation scenes and the infancy narratives. And then, of course, they're rewarded by seeing Jesus. So just a word on that. And now the final thing I'd like to say is that final scene of Jesus on the mountain commissioning his disciples, the 11, how precise is Matthew, to go out and to spread the good news. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. There's an echo there of where Jesus is seen as the Son of Man, the Son of Man language, because authority is given to the Ancient of Days, to the Son of Man, by the Ancient of Days to the Son of Man, so that peoples of all nations and languages will come to serve him. Then the disciples are sent out to all the nations, no longer to the Jewish people, but to all the nations. They're to be baptized, and then to be taught all that I command you. That language is very Exodus language, what God commands us. And that's very appropriate language for the great lawgiver of the new covenant, Jesus. All that I command you. And the final phrase, I am with you always, yes, until the end of time, is very like the very first words said of Jesus, that he's going to be Emmanuel, God with us. I am with you always. The Old Testament promise, do not be afraid, I am with you, from Isaiah 41, is very clearly in the background of that too. And so this extraordinary sense of being sent out with the authority and the presence of Jesus always with us is transforming these disciples into wonderful apostles. And that scene of him being with us goes from generation to generation until the end of time. Thanks, everybody.
Closer than you know, humble lamb, fragile flesh, crying out, closer than you know. I am here, close to you, tear the veil and see. Step, your every breath, I share eternally. Disfigured face, wounded fool, rejected sign, giving all I am, torn away, tortured soul, sacrificed, giving all I am. I am here, close to you, tear the veil share eternally. I am here, your God revealed, crucified, closer than you know. Abundant love, enduring hope, opened up, closer than you know. I am here, close to you. Tear the veil and see your every step, your every breath. I share eternally. I share eternally. I share eternally.